I first learned that Fox News' Tucker Carlson had mentioned one of my tweets on air because my wife's conservative aunt sent her a video of it. Now, this wasn't terribly surprising. The tweet had already been mocked by Donald Trump Jr., a number of other conservatives, and many, many, many other people. But it was not really surprising that Carlson jumped on it, but it was surprising because of the content of the tweet. So what did I say? Well, I said that the report released by Special Counsel Robert Mueller had largely validated the reporting that had gone on over the prior 2 years about Russian interference. I mean, it seemed like obviously non-objectionable. There were citations in the report itself of reports from the New York Times, the Washington Post, one of my own even. But for some reason, this was seen as something that shouldn't be said. And that's because there are two universes. And there's another universe where more than a year ago, things went down a different path, where the mainstream media was involved in trying to take down President Trump and misleading people about what had happened with Russia, where there were covert agents inside the government that were doing the same and targeting the president, where Robert Mueller's report wasn't what Robert Mueller's report actually said, but instead an exoneration of everything that had gone on. Now, the point here isn't that that's not actually what the report said. It was obviously much more nuanced. The point is that we now live in a time when we can have two different universes of thought about something as relatively objective as a report from the special counsel. And we live in a time where much worse things than that can happen. So how did we get here? I like to harken back to my youth in the 1980s when we had 3 television networks, when we had 2 newspapers we got. We got one in the morning and one in the afternoon that caught us up on what had happened over the course of the day. This was a time that, as it turns out, was at the tail end of the longest dark age in human history, that period before the internet, before digital media, when it wasn't the case that you could take information and share it universally and preserve it forever. But it was also, as it turns out, and as we're learning now, the end of a period in which Americans generally agreed on what was happening in the world. Why? What happened? Well, consider what the media was at that point. The media was mass media, and what made the media mass media was that the media had distribution systems, right? The media controlled information because they controlled the ability to actually get information out. Television networks had broadcast licenses from the government. They had huge facilities where they could broadcast. The Washington Post had printing presses. We had delivery trucks. We had newspaper boys that delivered the paper to your house. All of those things made it so that the media was able to share information in a way that others weren't. Then the internet arrived. The first thing we all know with the internet is you can get information anywhere, any information you want. Like back in the 1980s, you had to go to the library to learn something. Now I can ask this black tube that's in my living room, right? But what happened then was social media. And what social media did was it made it so that you have an app in your pocket. You can take a phone, or you can take a photo with your phone and share it instantaneously with anyone, anywhere in the world, right? Every media is now mass media. Everyone has the same capability to share information that was once reserved for the Washington Post and ABC News. Everyone has the ability to tell stories, to create videos, and share them instantaneously with anywhere in the world. Now, the ideal of social media was noble, democratize, lift up stories that wouldn't otherwise be heard, give people the ability to organize and speak out. The problem in the United States is that the emergence of social media also overlapped with 2 other trends that polluted that ideal. So one of those trends was, in the 1970s, in the Watergate era, confidence in the media was about 70%. But by Barack Obama's second term in office, it had dipped into the 40s. Confidence in newspapers, confidence in television news, both of those similarly declined. So did confidence in medical systems, in the church and Congress. There's been a broad increase in distrust of institutions. The other trend that overlapped with this was partisanship, sharp political partisanship. Pew Research Center tells us now that members of one political party, more than half of them, are likely to see members of the other political party as an actual threat to the United States. That is a status that didn't exist prior to now, and that has shaped how we use the tools we have at our disposal. So what does social media give us? It gives us the ability to communicate with others one-on-one and to create networks, communities of people. And the example I like to use with this, to highlight how effective the internet is at that, is a thing called furries. Maybe you're not familiar with furries. There's a group of people that like to dress like animals, sometimes for sexual satisfaction. Back in the 1970s, if this is what you're into, you'd maybe take out an ad in the back of a weird magazine or something and hope for the best. But now what you can do is you can go to the Javits Center in New York, attend a convention, and learn how to make realistic fur. Because these people discovered, hey, I'm not alone. There's a lot of people out there like me who share this interest. Now, the furries are a small group. They're obviously not here what I'm here to talk about. This would be a differently titled talk if it were. But they are representative of the way that the internet allows us to build communities that share interests. We often talk about media bubbles, right? This is an example of that to some extent. People have groups where they share information, where they share homogeneous political identifications and news systems. But the problem with these bubbles isn't necessarily that. It's that these bubbles can also provide a support system where any theory or worldview can find accommodation and nourishment, where you can say things that otherwise in other places might be greeted with horror and find people who encourage it and applaud it. And we have real-world examples of what that looks like. We have the example of the shooting in Christchurch in New Zealand and the one in San Diego, both of which were stemmed from an online group called 8chan, a site called 8chan, where anti-Semitism and racism sit alongside open calls for violence. We have too QAnon, this bizarre conspiracy theory, which is essentially predicated on the idea that an anonymous source who tells people what they want to hear is necessarily more trustworthy than even the most conservative news outlet. The challenge that we have too is that for the Washington Post and other media organizations, which came from that era of the mass media, there was a norm that was established. You took the information that you had, you presented it as objectively as you possibly could. You were the gatekeeper, you were entrusted with that delivery mechanism, and therefore you tried to do your best to represent both sides. The problem we have now is that that objectivity is actually a market disadvantage. There is generally a greater market for subjective information than there is objective information. Think about this. If you are a big supporter of President Trump, would you rather read an article at the Washington Post which contextualizes what he says, points out places where he may have said some things that are incorrect, or would you rather read his Twitter feed and hear directly from Trump himself what it is he has to say? If you are someone who's a critic of President Trump and you're getting the latest update on the Russia investigation, would you rather hear that from a hopefully objective news source pointing out flaws and gaps in what we know, or would you rather read a Twitter thread saying how this is the next step in President Trump's downfall? The media is also responsible for the fact that the media is losing confidence, or that Americans are losing confidence in the media. Think about it. The media today is the Washington Post and ABC News, and it's also Breitbart, and it's also people who have Twitter accounts, and it's people who are talking heads on MSNBC and CNN. It is a huge universe in a polarized time, and it's very easy to point to examples of the media that you don't like, you see as biased, and you see as problematic. The media also eats itself. The media, there's an aspect of the media which is focused on dragging down the other side. There are sites on both the left and the right which are aimed, their sole job is to figure out places where the mainstream media or conservative media or liberal media made mistakes, stepped too far, and then they share that with their in-group. They share that and they highlight it to bolster the attention that they get. Now, obviously, this isn't only about partisanship. It's also about economics. In the 2016 campaign, I profiled a kid who was up in Albany, and he had a website that was, we talk about fake news a lot, but this is real fake news. He made up polls. He just put out nonsense about President Trump. On 2 occasions, then came that Trump actually retweeted some of his articles. But his site was called Printly. Now, why was it called Printly? It was called Printly because he had a print design shop until he discovered he can make more money making up fake information, putting it on the web, covering it with ads. Now, BuzzFeed had a great report during the 2016 election about these teenagers in Macedonia who figured out the same thing. They could put out pro-Trump nonsense on web pages and make a ton of money. They leveraged Facebook. They shared all this stuff online. They were bragging about all the new sneakers they could buy. Now, this is important because Facebook was created to connect sellers to buyers. It's very good at that. It's made a lot of money doing that. But it also means that people who are selling dissent and distrust and hate can find buyers as well on these social networks. There's a reason that Russia's interference effort focused on social media in the 2016 election. Since the election, we've been trying to figure out how do we address this? What do we do about this problem? We don't have the answer to it. It is the case that Facebook, Twitter, Google, other social media companies have a new focus on this issue, have tried to implement changes that actually make this thing work. They aren't all the way there yet, but they're getting there. So what do we do at the Washington Post? Well, we contextualize, we fact check, but even that has problems. For example, I spoke with a researcher at the University of Washington who does research into conspiracy theories. And she showed me a network map of all the places, all the links that these conspiracy theories were fostered, and there's a big old Washington Post right in the middle. And so I asked her, why is the Washington Post in the middle of this conspiracy theory? And the answer was, because we had tried to debunk the conspiracy theory, that was seen as evidence that it was worth debunking. Then, of course, there's the point that a lot of people are targeting the Washington Post, right? The media eats itself. As I said, there is a vested interest for some groups in tearing down the Washington Post, suggesting that we are not an objective news organization, that we are inherently biased, right? This is why Tucker Carlson was highlighting my tweet. I was an example of the out-of-control Washington Post with its agenda. Obviously, Tucker Carlson isn't the only one that does this. President Trump does it as well. He targets mainstream media, says that they are saying untrue things. Even just yesterday, he gave a speech in which he suggested anonymous sources aren't real sources, they're made up, which of course they aren't. And obviously, if you read the Mueller report, you can see that some of those sources that were used were accurate. There is now, there's a report that came out last year from this group called Freedom House, which looked at digital authoritarianism, which is a hard word to say apparently. And what this report showed is that in China, for example, China has a robust system of surveillance, of control. It is now exporting that. It is now creating a marketplace for other governments to control their citizens using the same tools. It is selling them the tools to do that. We are seeing that bad actors can leverage these bubbles to trap people in information spheres. And we're seeing that they are now sharing that information with each other. So at the Washington Post, I get a lot of emails, most of them not particularly friendly. A lot of them criticize me for the bias in my reporting. I try and be objective, but what I've learned over time is that a lot of that criticism, a lot of people say, well, if you want to restore trust in the media, you have to eliminate the bias in your coverage. A lot of what people are saying to me, though, is they want to see the bias they expect from the media ecosphere in which they live. They want to see, I've had people say to me, Sean Hannity covers this straight, why don't you, right? That obviously is problematic. A lot of the times, this is also accompanied by calls for what happened to the old Washington Post, the Watergate Washington Post, the Bob Woodward, the Carl Bernstein, all the President's Men Washington Post, which I always think is ironic because it's not as though we are going easy on President Trump all the time. But that said, what that brings to mind is how things have changed since 1974. Washington Post is powerful, not as powerful as it used to be. We still have great reporters, but now we exist in this gigantic media ecosystem, and it's harder to be heard, it's harder to stand out, and we have other parts of the media ecosystem that are attacking us. But really what it makes me think about, a comment that Richard Nixon's former White House counsel, John Dean, made in an interview with Rolling Stone magazine in 2017. And what Dean said was, if Nixon had had the Fox News and conservative media ecosystem that exists today, he probably would have survived as president. And I think that is obviously true. If you look at the reaction to the Mueller report in particular, the fact that this objective document can be seen in two very different ways by two very different groups of people who represent millions and millions of Americans, it is obviously problematic that there is that tension. It is, in short, chaos.